So thank you very much for joining us for our special IMAS and CMS webinar series. IMAS and CMS were keen on putting this together rather quickly, I might add, in response to the marine heatwave and a lot of the questions that we're hearing from within the stakeholder community and the scientific community about what the heatwave means, in particular for Tasmania. So we will take questions. There'll be a dedicated question and answer session at the end. I'd like you to mute at the start if you haven't already. Feel free to add your organisation details in the chat so that we know where you're from. And you can add your questions in the chat as we go along, or save them up and use the raise hand function at the end, but we will address all of the questions at the end. So today's webinar is called Turning Up the Temperature, looking at impacts on the ecosystem. I'm your host. I'm Professor Greta Petzel from the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and the Centre for Marine Socioecology. But our chair today is Associate Professor Kerrie Swadling, a very accomplished marine ecologist that's done lots of work on the east coast of Tasmania, looking at marine ecosystems and then change in those systems in particular. So we're very pleased to have Kerrie as our chair for today's webinar. I'll start off with an acknowledgement of country before we hand over to Kerrie. We're on the lands of the Muwinina people, so we're very privileged to live and work on the land, seas, waterways and skies of the Muwinina people here in Nipalina Lutruwita. I think acknowledgements of country are always important, but in particular in the context of climate change, where Indigenous peoples all over the world have such an extensive depth and breadth of knowledge of changes over deep time. So the purpose of today's webinar series is really just to try and get some high-level awareness and discussion around what's happening with the marine heatwave. Yesterday, we had a series of short talks about the physical changes in the coast, off the east coast of Tasmania mainly. Today, we'll be talking about ecosystem changes or potential changes. Tomorrow, there's a session related mainly to fisheries and aquaculture. And then on Thursday, we'll be talking about what are some of the responses that are happening to try and address these changes and manage them as best that we can. And then on Friday, we'll have a session that's dedicated to communicating about climate change under some pretty challenging circumstances sometimes. So a reminder to please mute, and I will hand over to Kerrie.
Come on. Okay, right. Thank you, Greta. Now my video doesn't want to come on.
That's all right. It's 2023, Kerrie. These things.
I will just start speaking and sort it out. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. My name's Kerrie Swadling, as Greta said, and I'll be leading the session today on turning up the temperature, impacts on the ecosystem. Our first speaker today is Professor Gustaaf Hallegraeff, retired from IMAS a couple of years ago, but an incredible wealth of knowledge on algae and algae all around the coast of Tasmania. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Gustaaf. And if you can unmute, and we'll see if we can see you. Yeah, perfect. And if you would like to start, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Can you see the screen?
We can, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, I will address algal blooms, both the good and the bad blooms. I will look at the global warming signal, but also the heat wave that is happening now and what could it mean for local algal bloom and phytoplankton conditions. So the first misconception that I want to correct, and that appears everywhere, even in the IPCC reports, people think very naively, warming, algal grow faster, and therefore algal blooms should increase. not only in intensity, frequency also, but in global distribution. That simply is not correct. That is way too simple. And that real idea that derives from people looking at the local ponds and lakes, indeed, where there's lots of nutrients and you have cyanobacterial bloom, like here, this green blob, that is likely to increase, indeed, with warming. But that is a very special condition, and that is not at all representative for algal blooms in a marine environment. Oops. Try to move. That's it, the second slide. So another misconception is that there's considerable fear that some species of microscopic algae could become extinct. Again, that is completely wrong. We really misunderstand how incredibly diverse, adaptable, genetically diverse, but also physiologically plastic these species are. Under some conditions, some strains may increase, others decrease, but in general, the population will stay quite stable. And that is really, I'm trying to explain this in this diagram. So this wave could be a heat wave or environmental perturbations. And you can see these small little lizards that grow very fast, that move fast, that simply move with the environment. They survive. But this big dinosaur, slow growth rates, and I think this also represents human society, that will have a lot of difficulty in stepping over those major hurdles, and it could well become extinct. But another real advantage that the microscopic algae have, they live in the water. Water is a much more three-dimensionally structured environment than the land. You know, like if the water gets warmer on the surface, they simply dive down or they respond to a different nutrient parcel of water. So the algae will survive. I can sleep at night.
Gustaaf,
so now let's look at some, yep.
Gustaaf, sorry, can you just do the little full screen thing at the bottom on the right
yep.
there? Yeah, thanks. Awesome.
Now let's look at some global patterns. So just like Greta Peckel has been very active in creating a red map databases, I've been the chair for the past 10, 15 years of creating a UNESCO database on harmful algal bloom events. And there are probably about 10,000 records in it today. This is called HADAT, Harmful Algal Event Database. And you can search it. It's a publicly accessible database. And as happens with those databases, so different parts of the world, you know, have more or less data. And if you analyze these patterns, you have to correct for the number of observations. So we've done it with an enormous amount of statistical analysis looking for trends. So these are different regions of the world, and these are data series of 35 years, East Coast of America, Central America and the Caribbean, South America, and so on. These are all different regions of the world. And we look for trends in harmful algal blooms in this case. And there's no uniform global trend. In some cases, it stays the same. In some other cases, it increases, but in some other areas, it decreases. And that's what you would expect. The other thing is there's an enormous amount of different algal species, like 5,000 species, maybe 200 of them cause problems, and they all behave differently. You would not expect that they all behave in the same way. But still, from this database, we picked up a number of areas in the world where we see emergent new impacts. Tasmania is one of them. There are some things happening that we did not see here in the past 50 years. Here, Chile is another one. The Canary Islands, where we have a problem called Cicotera that was never present there before. Florida, we see changes. And of course, Alaska, there's a lot of warming happening and concern for marine mammals and so on. And also here in the Arabian Gulf, there are some changes happening. And so these changes are analyzed in great detail. What does it tell us? And so these are some early results. So this is, we heard yesterday about a number of previous heatwave events, like the 2015, 2016 El Nino heatwave driven event in the Pacific Basin. So this is the Pacific Basin. Different areas showed heat waves, particularly here. This was called the warm blob in North America, here also in Chile. We also had an event here in Tasmania. But maybe not surprisingly, after my introduction, we saw different species respond in those three different areas in very different ways. So in Tasmania, we had a sudden appearance of a toxic dinoflagellate that caused quite some problems for the seafood industry. We now know that it has always been here for at least the past 10,000 years from ancient DNA work and sediment cores, but it was a cryptic species. It never caused major problems. And what suddenly happened here is the winter conditions changed. Normally the winter is turbulent, and now suddenly we had stratified conditions in the winter. This is actually a cold water species. It's not a warm water species. So this was one response. In Chile, which was also normally a cold water area, we also had these Alexandrian blooms, but on top of it, we had a flagellate which cost $800 million worth of salmon mortality. And then the United States, we had yet another organism, this is a diatom, and that responded to changes in the seasonal upwelling. So different species respond in very different ways. It's no uniform global trend. So finally, this coming heat wave that is coming to the east coast of Tasmania, I've been looking at it. What can it do? So in terms of toxic algal blooms impacting on the seafood industry, we have two species, Alexandrium catanella, which is a cold water species. So we actually expect that it had a narrow window of opportunity in the winter. If it gets warmer and warmer, this species will disappear again, go to sleep. So that's good news. In the Durban and the Huon estuaries, we have another dinoflagellate, Chimney catenatum. It's a warm water species. It likes stratification, but it also needs rainfall events. So it depends where there's sufficient rain happening in response to the current heat wave for that to increase. The other good news is that over time, all the shellfish farms in that area have largely gone bankrupt, and there's only a few farms still that potentially could be impacted. So not much of an impact here. Other species that are highly visible to the public is these Noctiluca red slicks. It likes stratification, but it needs a lot of diatom food. And that is where the real uncertainties are. So it's not with the harmful algal species, and Noctiluca really is not that harmful. It is with the good food species like the diatom springbloom. And so this is driven by nutrients. The East Australian current is low in nutrients, but most of the nutrients can be sucked in from the subantarctic. And it's this interplay that really will drive what's happening is diatom springbloom. Over the past 40 years that I've been working in Tasmanian coastal waters, we have seen that the springbloom usually in the 1980s and 90s used to be in September, October. It actually moved to the first weeks of August now. And that is where the problems come. First of all, there's a risk of a trophic mismatch, that the larval fish and whatever that is, depending upon this bloom, is certainly not expecting it in August. But the other thing that is happening, this diatom spring bloom now is happening at much shorter day lengths. So we should have less productivity. So this is where the real problems are, and we see this globally. So warming is not a case of more algal blooms. It is what is it going to do with the productive diatom blooms. So that's where I'll leave it for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustaaf. And there already is a question in the chat, but we'll save that till the end. Our next speaker is Dr. Cayne Layton. Cayne has been doing lots of very interesting work in the kelp area, and his talk is Kelp, Help is on the Way. Thank you, Cayne.
Awesome. Thank you, Kerrie. Can you see my slides and hear me and everything's good?
We need you to go into presenter slide.
Mode.
Yes, please, presenter mode.
Try again.
I'd like to apologise to anyone that just joined us, as it seems like we had an incorrect link that some of you may have been trying to use to get online. If you go display settings at the top there, top left.
Yeah.
Click on the down and swap presenter.
Just nuked it. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Do you think after how many years now of being, online lecturing and tutoring, we'd have this under wraps at every time? Like Greta said, I can see her chuckling there. It's 2023, so the world's a strange place. Thank you very much to Greta and Emily and everyone for the invite today. So I'm a research fellow and a lecturer at IMAS and CMS as well, and I'm just going to give a real quick kind of brief introduction and hopefully kind of generate some questions around kelp forests in Tassie, and particularly with relevance to this marine heat wave. So we've got multiple kelp species in Tassie. Obviously our giant kelp, very iconic, very charismatic as far as seaweed goes. It gets a lot of the attention, but we have the real kind of diversity of kelp species, and that's important because there's winners and losers, and kelp in general are quite understudied, relative to other things like corals and a lot of fishery species. But, even amongst kelp, there's some that are basically entirely unstudied, even in a place like Tasmania, that's a real world leader in kelp forest ecology and kelp forest research. Kelp, just like trees on land, kelp are really the foundation of the ecosystem. Without kelp, you don't have the kelp forest, and those kelp forests are in turn the foundation of our incredible rocky reef systems and of the Great Southern Reef, which is this continent scale reef system that we have here in southern Australia and all around Tassie as well. And just like our Tasmanian forests on land, our Tasmanian kelp forests are home to a massively diverse and a unique community of flora and fauna, and that is unique on a global scale. That's one of the real kind of key features of the Great Southern Reef and our rocky reef systems, is those really, really high levels of what we call endemism, which is basically just uniqueness. Depending on the species you're looking at, or the group of organisms, that you're looking at, up to 60 to 70% of them occur nowhere else. And that's obviously incredibly important biologically and ecologically, but if you think about it, also puts a lot of responsibility on us, because we're kind of the guardians and helping to manage and to understand and to research these organisms and these ecosystems that occur nowhere else in the world. It's here and that's it. Not only are they hugely environmentally important, really economically important. Across Australia, kelp forests generate about 10 billion with a B, dollars to the Australian economy per year. That's mostly direct inputs such as fisheries, our rock lobster, our abalone fisheries. Those rely completely on our kelp forests. Without kelp, we don't have those fisheries. We really haven't been able to study a lot of the more indirect economic impacts and inputs of our kelp forests. And again, that's a real running theme that you'll hear me say quite a bit in these next few minutes, is just how kind of understudied and undervalued these systems are, especially relative to, some of our other great reef systems in Australia, like the Great Barrier Reef. So our kelp forests are under threat in Tasmania, unfortunately. They're also under threat across the Great Southern Reef and globally as well. So, that paints, I guess, a little bit of a sad picture about these threats that these really important systems are facing across the world. But it also means that we have a real role to play. And, there are a lot of eyes on places like Australia and Tasmania, where, the knowledge that we're generating, the research that we're doing can be applied elsewhere, and we all kind of collaborate and learn from one another. So kelp forest and marine heat waves. So we heard a lot about kind of the physical effects of marine heat waves yesterday, but just to kind of clarify and to reiterate for anyone who wasn't there yesterday, marine heat waves are different from background ocean warming. So the same way that we have warming on land, and then we might have a particularly hot summer or a heat wave that comes through, it's really the same in the ocean. So we've had this background warming that's been happening, basically since kind of, just the industrial era. And then we have these periods of quite much more intense but shorter periods of warming over the top of that, and these are marine heat waves. And that's important to understand because it has very different impacts on the ecosystem, on the biology of these species, and they respond quite differently. But there is a precedence for understanding that marine heat waves have caused kelp loss across the world, in the US, across Europe, and also in Australia. In the 2010-2011 heat wave in Western Australia, there was a 100-kilometre reduction in golden kelp, or the Great Southern Reef, basically. So the kelp is the foundation of the reef. So with that reduction or that retraction of kelp because of this marine heat wave, the Great Southern Reef has had a permanent retraction of 100 kilometres. And that's still the case today. You can see in that picture in the bottom left by Professor Thomas Wernberg from UWA, this environment has transitioned. We've lost all of that lovely golden kelp on the left there, and it's transitioned to an environment that's dominated by a lot more smaller algae, different species of algae that support different species. And that's a really key point again, is that, we know that these are home to such a massive diversity of species and ecosystem services. So the impacts and the interactions with marine heat waves can be very complex. Again, there's going to be winners and losers. You can have habitat-wide impacts. You can have impacts at different species. And just in this instance, the loss of that one kelp has really shifted this entire ecosystem around to be dominated by much more kind of subtropical warm water seaweeds, and then warm water fishes and stuff as well. In 2015, 2016, we heard from Gustaaf, and we heard yesterday as well, about the Tasman Sea marine heat wave, one of the biggest and the longest marine heat waves ever recorded. We had anecdotal losses of bull kelp and giant kelp here in Tasmania. I say anecdotal because we really struggled to get a lot of resources for monitoring, and in some ways that heat wave was a little bit more unexpected than this one, perhaps. Our forecasting is getting better all the time, and so we really kind of playing catch up, I guess, with a lot of those impacts and understanding those impacts. But really reliable reports of significant amounts of bull kelp, for example, washing up on beaches, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But also losses of abalone, again, those species within the forest, in this instance, a species that's very economically important. So yeah, it's a very it can be very complex, but there's a lot of work that we're doing here at IMAS to understand and potentially even allow some adaptation to these marine heat waves. So there's a lot of monitoring happening right now in preparation for this summer that we know is forecast to be very hot with this marine heat wave that's coming. We're all still going out and doing a lot of kind of pre-monitoring, and the idea is once that heat wave hits and kind of January, February and March kind of rolls around, we'll get back out to repeat a lot of that monitoring. That's not something that's just happening in Tasmania. Happening across the Great Southern Reef as well, from New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia. That's really led a lot by the Great Southern Reef Research Partnership, and in Tasmania especially, that's Scott Bennett's doing a lot of that work. He's another IMAS CMS person doing a lot of biology and physiology, so understanding the direct impacts of the way that temperature increases, whether or not they're short-term or long-term, impact kelp and the other species that call these forests home. Underpinning a lot of that is the genetics, understanding are some populations more susceptible than others? What are the impacts at a genetic level of a marine heat wave? Do you see a particular strain or variety of of species being lost? And then we're also going out and doing quite a lot of seed banking. So it's almost a form of genetic conservation. If we can potentially select some stuff from the field or collect some stuff from the field and put it into our seed bank at IMAS, that might buy us a little bit of time, and it's a little bit of an insurance policy. And I think some members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Community Corporation, are talking later in the week about some of the work we've just done that they've been leading with us around that. Both the biology, the monitoring, and the genetics also underpin our habitat restoration efforts. And this isn't going to be the solution to all of these problems. We're still fighting with climate change and warming, but it's just another tool in our toolbox to help us respond and help us manage these environments. The future is going to be, a lot tougher for kelp forests in Tasmania than it was historically. And so, we need all the tools in our toolbox, and we need to probably start actively managing these environments the same way that we actively manage a lot of our land environments. Part of that is also understanding a lot of the other stresses in the environment, such as urchins. And I won't talk much about that because I know Dr. Katie Creswell and Dr. John Cayne, also from IMAS and CMS, are talking tomorrow about that. But a lot of understanding of the ecology of those impacts of the urchins, and also how a fishery might be able to generate some value and help us overcome some of these losses. This is my final slide. So what can you do? So please keep your eyes open. Observations that you can make are actually really incredibly valuable to us. You can log them on RedMap. iNaturalist, the Atlas of Living Australia. You can even just email us. My email's there on the right-hand side, or, you can find the IMAS general email online. You can see there's a photo there from someone who's just emailed me called Graham, didn't give me his last name, had a good chat to Graham for a while about some, you can see in the middle of that seaweed rack's actually a whole bunch of leather jackets. And that was a few years ago. Just noticed a massive amount of this seaweed, but also these leather jackets washed up on the beach, and emailed a few people at IMAS, and we had some discussions about that. And we actually were able to identify that that was actually due to a cold water event, a cold water kind of eddy that came down and affected these leather jackets, these fish that are actually more tropical. And on the far right there, you can see another kind of photo I got from an email from a gentleman on the south coast of New South Wales, using himself for scale. Very good scientific rigor there. With some giant kelp that's washed up. So again, these really out of range, peculiar observations can be really, really valuable to us. So I do ask, if you do take some photos, take a close-up one, and then also take a far away one. That just helps us ID the photos. I get a lot of photos. Some of my family and friends are the worst offenders of just, a way zoomed out shot of just some blobs on the beach. And they say, Cayne, what seaweed's this? And, I'm very thankful that they are so confident in my skills, but all I can really say is that that's a lump of seaweed. But also, keep talking, talk with your friends and families about what you're seeing. Some of these impacts that you might be feeling are coming, maybe something that you're worried about. Just please, always talk about this and seek out as much information as you can. And also, if you can, advocate for kelp forests in the Great Southern Reef. Like I said, we really are chronically underfunded relative to the Great Barrier Reef, for example. We get less than 1% of the funding of the Great Barrier Reef. So, really very underfunded, understudied, and underappreciated, but we're hoping to change that. So awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Cayne. That's really good. In the interest of trying to keep to time, our next speaker will be Lauren Roman, Dr. Lauren Roman, who's a new DECRA postdoc at IMAS. Lauren's going to be speaking to us about seabirds. Lauren, if you can look at keeping within around 5 minutes or so. I know it's not long. Thanks. And your slides are fine, except can you go into presenter mode? And turn on your, are you turned on? You need to turn on your mic. Hey, Lauren, we can't hear you, so can you turn on your microphone? Okay. We're not hearing you, I'm sorry.
Kerrie, we could maybe go to Neville.
I was just thinking we might go straight to Nev if you're available, Nev.
Yep, I'm available if you can hear me, and I'll skip all those technical difficulties from PowerPoint by not actually producing another death by PowerPoint. So I'll just run through for a couple of minutes if you like.
Yeah, introduce yourself then.
Yeah, so I'm Neville Barrett.
Thank you.
Worked here at IMAS from sea fisheries days. So I've been around in the space for about 35 years, working on both biodiversity, coastal ecosystems, very long-term monitoring programs in Tasmania and elsewhere, as well as working on threatened species in particular, both starting with, spotted handfish from an honours kind of level year back in the 80, whatever it was, 89 or something, onto a whole range of things nowadays, including even, more geoscapes and things along the way. So the talk today was really around impacts on some of the threatened species in this region, from a heat wave in particular, but also I guess from a perspective of longer term warming, because this is really a short term mimic of what kind of happens there. you know, in general, you know, Tasmania, I mean, sort of Cayne was kind of fleshing out the overall richness of southern Australia, but the upshot is that Tasmania is absolutely a global hotspot for endemic marine species that live here and nowhere else. And that's really because we're on the southern part of Australia, you know, as the Australia's warmed up since the last, you know, global minimum or ice age maximum, I suppose. Yeah, things have been pushed south, the cold affinity species, and a lot of them have reached the southern end of their range. Some of them are sheltered water adapted species, and they really need to live in our estuaries and things. The red handfish and even to some degree the spotted handfish are very, you know, classic examples of that. And even the Maugean skate in Macquarie Harbour, that's a specialist adapted to, it's a deep sea species, it's adapted to living coastally, but only in sheltered environments. So there's nowhere else to go, even with a 1 or 2 degree Celsius warming. You know, we've modelled that with a whole lot of data for a pile of species, and you know, a lot of those things are pretty much predicted to go within the next 100 years under climate change. They simply can't exist anywhere else. And so that's a bad thing, but also some of those are going to be under very, very significant stress from you know, an upcoming kind of pulse heat wave. If we have something, you know, our data from around other parts of monitoring around Australia shows that if you get something like 4 degrees Celsius for 6 weeks, like they did in Western Australia during the 2012 heat wave, it can lead to the extrication of a whole range of species within an area if they're within their, you know, the northern end of their thermal happiness of their range. And that's likely to be potentially happening here this summer. So, you know, we've learnt lots of things from some of that monitoring around the place too. In Jurien and Western Australia, you know, one thing we did find of, you know, 4 degrees for 6 weeks was enough to tick off a whole range of species from that region that we don't see 10 years, 15 years later now. Things like false senator wrasses and senator wrasses at Jurien Bay at the northern end of their ranges, they've gone a bit like the kelps Cayne mentioned. So there are some lessons there. These heat waves can be kind of impactful, and we certainly think, you know, we're going to see some significant impacts this summer on a range of species if it comes to pass. Now, it may not hit the coast as planned. You know, Cayne mentioned that other heat wave, 2015-16. It looked bad in lots of parts of Tassie, but it actually wasn't, because most of it didn't come all the way across the shelf. If you're on the outer shelf, man, you were hit big time. I was out there. It was 4 degrees. It was 6 degrees warmer for a short period of time. Rarely hit the coast. So the coast didn't really warm up that much. A lot of those kelps that were washed up were after a massive east coast storm associated with all of that stuff that blasted bull kelp onto beaches that didn't come off in the heat, I can assure you. But you know, certainly lots of things would have been very stressed on the outer coast. Really, you know, we've only got you know, 5 minutes goes quickly, doesn't it? But you know, we got lots of species are under threat, but we've also got some things in place to kind of help address this. And one of those is, you know, putting species into aquaria. There's everything from Maugean skates going into aquaria now, but ideally, you know, you need to reduce some of those multiple stresses. So for Maugean skates, we need to get oxygen back into that harbour and pronto for this summer. For something like handfish, we've actually got red handfish in aquaria and spotted handfish in aquaria, and that's great. But there's a proposal to actually capture a lot of the remaining population of red handfish and actually put them into aquaria over this summer to stop the last remaining known population being potentially wiped out this summer. So that's a positive kind of action that can be undertaken, and it's going to be a big debate over the next couple of weeks about whether that's sensible. And I guess really it's 5 minutes. It's amazing how quick it goes, but I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nev, and for stepping in so quickly. It looks to me like Lauren is...
I'm back with a new headset.
Back with a new headset. Fantastic. Thank you. So we'll now hear from Dr. Lauren Roman talking about seabirds. We know things have been happening.
All right, I'll just check first that that's all working. Yep, perfect.
Yep,
so I'm going to talk really quickly about seabirds and the marine heat wave. So I'll try my best to keep to time. It's a little bit easier with this one because there's a lot more unknowns in this space compared to some of the others. So when most of many people think of seabirds in Tasmania and the marine heat wave, they probably think of this. If you went to the beach about, in the last few weeks, you may have seen a large mortality event of short-tailed shearwaters. And certainly there were quite a few voices in the media reporting this as a direct consequence of the marine heat wave that has now reached Tasmania, but was at the time still off New South Wales. But I just want to sort of broaden out the picture a little bit when it comes to seabirds and marine heat waves. So what I've got here is a sea surface temperature anomaly map centered on the Pacific Ocean. And you can see this is yesterday's, 10th over the weekend, the most recent anomaly map, and you can see that sort of hot water anomaly off that's currently off Tasmania, but you can also see what's going on in the broader Pacific Ocean right now. So we're not the only part of the world experiencing these very high sea surface temperatures compared to what it should be this time of year, unfortunately. What we know from seabirds is that, especially for seabirds that are heavily dependent on zooplanktons, they can have quite catastrophic influences if they can't get to their zooplankton prey. So whether this is because the zooplankton is spawning or swarming somewhere else, whether the usual time that they expect it to be big masses of zooplankton of a variety of species in one location, whether those zooplanktons are shifting their behavior earlier or later as a result of sea surface temperatures. And the species that tend to be most vulnerable to this are plankton-eating seabirds. And I'm going to focus this talk a little bit because I've only got a few minutes on short-tailed shearwater, given they're such an iconic and culturally important species here in Tasmania. So this is the other day's sea surface temperature anomaly chart. I just want to take you back to a couple of months ago. So this is the sea surface temperature anomaly chart around the end of October. So why this is important for the short-tailed shearwaters is this is when the birds that started washing up in mid-October, this is around the time that those particular birds would have been leaving the northern hemisphere on their migration. And there's a couple of different areas. We haven't got as much tracking of this species during their migration as we would like, but we do have some. So what we know is that the earliest birds arrive in the sort of around the end of September. Most of them will arrive during October, especially if they're hoping to breed that year. The latest birds will be leaving at the end of October, and they'll be arriving as late as mid-November. So this is a little graph here from a thesis from a PhD student a couple of years ago who did some tracking during the winter foraging range of short-tailed shearwaters. And what you can see is there's sort of two behavior patterns about where they go. Some of them go to the eastern North Pacific and some of them go to the western North Pacific. And what you can see is the area that these birds were foraging in just before they began their southbound migration was undergoing, some serious sea surface temperature anomalies. And if you compare that to the sea surface temperature anomaly that we're experiencing down here at the time, so the early beginnings of the heat wave that's currently moving its way down to Tasmania, it's not quite so severe. So what we know about the wreck event of short-tailed shearwaters is that when they arrived, they were in starving body condition. So to me, that suggests, even though we don't know for sure, that there was probably something going on in the food, in what food was available to them, and that to get into that body condition takes quite some time. So I would suggest that they were probably in poor body condition when they left from their migration, rather than that starvation event being linked to what is going on down here right now. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's much more likely that the foraging conditions where they came from were altered by that sea surface temperature. So short-tailed shearwaters can fly very long distances to find food. So we do have information suggesting that if the feed conditions are bad, say around Tasmania, they can go and forage in other places. And just off Antarctica is an important foraging area. So is this heat wave likely to cause big mortalities in short-tailed shearwaters? I mean, it's too early to know. We'll have to see what happens when it hangs around. But as far as the best that I know is we don't have a precedent for this in the Tasmania end of things. However, that's not to say that we don't have other species that might be vulnerable to plankton conditions closer to Tassie. So Tasmania is home to 3 seabirds that are very heavily planktonivorous, common diving petrels, white-faced storm petrels, and fairy prions. They're a little bit smaller. They don't go nearly as far to find food as short-tailed shearwaters. So if we were to be looking at which species might be vulnerable, these are the 3 species that I think we'd be better off, or that we should be probably a little bit more concerned about. And the bad news for this is we don't have any monitoring, as far as I'm aware, for these species, and that if bad feed conditions lead to chick loss, it's actually quite unlikely to be detected because they nest in burrows on remote islands. So really, to understand the impact of climate change and heat waves on planktivorous seabirds, you need to do quite targeted research studies. And yeah, it's quite difficult for this species. So a bit of a depressing end to that story, but yeah, hopefully that'll lead into some of the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lauren, and thank you very much to all of the speakers for covering a very broad topic in a very short amount of time. I'd like to open up for questions now. You can either put something into the chat or use the little hand under the reactions tab. I've noticed that Jamie and Gustaaf have already addressed a couple of Jamie's questions in the background. But I will go back and just look at what else has been put here. So Jamie did ask Cayne, do we have any rough estimates of loss of kelps from the 15-16 marine heat wave? And has there been any work on Lawsonia corrugata and thermal tolerance ranges?
So no, we don't have any specific or even rough estimates of losses from that 15-16 heatwave. And like Nev said, there are a lot of other things happening at the time, like that big East Coast low that really could be, or it was, a really strong driver of the loss of a lot of that bull kelp that washed up. Specific to Lawsonia corrugata, for those of you who don't know, this is one of those species that only occurs in Tasmania, nowhere else in the world. It's our only kind of, it's one of our only globally unique kelp species here. We've just finished some work led by Cody James and Damon Britton at IMAS looking at the thermal tolerance of this species, and it is actually pretty low. It's already in its stressful zone throughout our summers, and so the heat waves have the real big potential to threaten this species, and it's one of also the most kind of understudied and underappreciated kelps in Tassie. A lot of the long-term monitoring that Nev through that ATRC, the Australian Temperate Reef Collaboration, and also Graham Edgar and Rick Stewart-Smith through Reef Life Survey have been able to have been doing in Tassie across kind of the last 10, 15, 20 years, has shown that there have been retractions and reductions in Lawsonia by about 30%, which is really alarming. Like in terms of, the IUCN listing of species that are under threat, that would put it on the red list. But really, in many cases, the declines of this species have really gone unnoticed and, really not broadly discussed.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there and just make a comment on that. We do have long-term monitoring on it, so we do have some quite reasonable data on that species. We're not actively targeting it, so we're not always as shallow for our dive surveys as it's found, but as Cayne said, it has seen reduction in the northern part of its range, I think, in the Tas region, but also notably, it no longer exists, on Wilson's Promontory, where it was also found at one stage, up until at least the 70s. I've looked for it very extensively in its core habitat in Victoria now and have never seen any plants. So we can assume already that species has contracted its range by 50, 60 kilometres at least across Bass Strait to the Kent Group or so. So we're already seeing some movement of species like that. And I'll just have another comment on that Noctiluca thing, from Jamie, when it first rocked up. First time we saw it was in the year 2000, and there was a big bloom had washed in at Triabunna, and we didn't know what it was. We'd just been working out at Maria, and I stopped our big ship at the time and scooped up a pile of it, thinking it was fish eggs. And I was outside the Triabunna mill, and I brought it back to work on the Friday night, and I took it to colleagues at CSIRO and said, these what are these? And I looked under a microscope at work when I got here, and I realised it couldn't be a fish egg. It didn't have the right oil droplets and things. And, you know, they wrote back in Jamison very quickly to say, no, you've got a pile of Noctiluca. It's amazing.
So an interesting comment to add about Noctiluca, which is increasing all around Australia. It's one of those species, you know, it's just in a bloom phase, and that bloom phase could last 40 to 50 years. It's beautifully bioluminescent, and the public loves it, but it is causing great problems for defense. All of these nuclear submarines, they're scared shit about it, and they have all kind of special monitoring equipment on board to actually make sure that they're not steaming into a bioluminescent patch and become visible via satellite to the enemy. So more funding streams.
Exactly. Well, it's a big threat to the marine farms too, because that next year, that same bloom continued through, I think. And I think, Gustaaf, did you show a farm, that Port Arthur farm?
Yeah, so that is New Guinea. So
huge fish deaths.
Yeah. So the good news there is we actually done here in IMAS a lot of work to test it on fish and fish gills. And it's among the least harmful species of algae. It does not produce permanent damage to gills. It's only, you need to have extremely dense slicks at the very surface layer. And farms can just wipe that out via bubble screens that we help them introduce in New Guinea, or perimeter skirts around the net pens. So at least Noctiluca, there's a very easy solution.
Okay, thanks, Gustaaf. I personally hate it because of what it does to the local zooplankton. I've got another question in the chat here, again from Jamie, and this one's for you, Nev, around your comments on the handfish and skates. Just that it's a huge debate, and he's hoping that the Palawa community is being involved in these debates of any sort of plans for captive breeding.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, Jamie. I really don't have any idea because I'm not across that side of things. The work on the Maugean skate, that's more to, you know, try and protect it, to stop it going extinct, given that people aren't so keen on restoring oxygen in the harbour in a hurry, and we could lose the whole population there very, very quickly. So that's a given. I think, yes, Indigenous folks are part of that because they've been on the what do you call it, the committee around the skate, the recovery committee. So that's one positive. I'm not so sure about the red handfish. That's a discussion and a big meeting that's, I think, just got an email then. It's happening this coming Thursday, and that's organised by DCHU, the Commonwealth Department, as well as the state threatened species folks, to discuss the possibility. And the idea isn't captive breeding. The idea for that one would just be to hold a moderate number of the existing population in aquaria in cooler conditions over the worst of the heat wave, and then reintroduce them to that area. So that's not part of just capturing fish for doing captive breeding. There's already some captive breeding going on, but that would be just about trying to protect the remaining population from becoming extinct, if you like, if this heat wave does come to pass and we do end up with, say, 4 or 5 weeks above 4 degrees, which every other bit of our evidence suggests will kill them as well as a lot of other species at the northern end of their range.
Thanks, Nev. So we're getting close to time. Is there one last question that anyone would like to ask? I think it's a huge topic. When we get into the ecosystems, it's not something that's easily dealt with over a 1 hour slot. But there's some positives there. And to me, some of the things that seem important are, one, observations and recording your observations, talking. I think Cayne made that point. Talking amongst your communities and talking between communities is obviously important. And from a more scientific viewpoint, I think we really need to understand a lot more about thermal tolerance. And Gustaaf pointed this out, as did Lauren. It's those species-specific responses that we actually know very little about to this day, and that's where a lot of our efforts will also need to go. So thank you very much, and I'll let Greta now just wrap up for us.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Kerrie, and thank you very much to our speakers. is a lot to cover in just an hour, but the idea of these webinars is to just give everybody a little taster of the kind of information that we're aware of in terms of impacts around the heat wave, and what kind of actions are happening in different parts of the research and other parts of the community. So thanks very much for logging on. Tomorrow, as a reminder, we've got From Ocean to the Plate, impacts and hot tips for seafood. So talking about abalone, lobster, aquaculture, and then tips for harvest and supply of safe seafood. So I really hope you can join us tomorrow at 9:10. We've got the link up there on the screen for where you can find recordings of the webinars when we have those ready. And I just want to finish off by highlighting that there is a marine heatwave response plan on the NRE Tasmania website that you can get more information on. And on Thursday, we'll also be hearing about the Palawa heatwave marine response plan as well. So I can hope you can join us later on in the week. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening and for your questions. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you later on in the week as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greta.